The flames danced violently against the night sky, turning my family's century-old barn into a blazing inferno. The thick smoke clawed at my throat, stinging my eyes as I stood there, frozen, gripping a useless bucket of water. The fire spread too fast, too deliberate. I knew this wasn't an accident. My animals screamed in terror, my farmhouse glowed orange from the reflection, and in the distance I saw them, smug faces watching from across the road. The Homeowners Association board members, their silhouettes faint under the flickering streetlights. One of them, probably HOA President Richard Thompson, raised a phone, taking a picture like it was some kind of victory trophy. And that's when it hit me. They did this. They burned my farm to force me to sell. I had spent my whole life on this land, living a quiet, stubborn existence, running the farm my grandfather left me. It wasn't fancy, it wasn't modern, but it was mine. And I knew from the day I moved back here that the HOA saw me as an inconvenience. A reminder that this place had history before they came in with their overpriced, identical houses and their obsession with uniformity. My farm was the last piece of imperfection in their pristine community, and they wanted it gone. They tried everything: petty fines, fake noise complaints, letters filled with legal nonsense I never read. But I ignored them. Maybe I should have paid more attention. Because now, as I stood in the dirt watching my barn collapse, I realized they weren't just playing dirty. They were willing to destroy everything I had to get what they wanted. The fire department arrived too late to save anything. By the time they doused the last embers, my barn was nothing but smoldering rubble, my storage shed reduced to ash, and my animals, God, my animals. Some survived, but I lost too many. My favorite cow, Bessie, gone. My grandfather's old wooden tools, melted. The family photo albums I kept in the barn loft turned to smoke. The fire chief, a round-bellied man with tired eyes, shook his head and gave me a speech about how fires like this happen and how it's hard to determine the cause. But I saw it in his face. He knew. Everybody in this town knew. The HOA had been gunning for me for years, and now, conveniently, my biggest obstacle to selling had gone up in flames. I could already hear it, even before it happened. The HOA pretending to be sympathetic, offering to help by buying my land, dirt cheap, of course. I could already see Richard Thompson showing up at my door with that fake, concerned look, telling me how devastated he was for my loss, while barely hiding his excitement. The anger boiled inside me, hot as the fire that had just devoured my life. I wasn't stupid. I knew I couldn't just march over there and accuse them outright. HOAs were masters at covering their tracks, hiding behind bylaws and bureaucracy. But I wasn't going to let this go. No, they wanted to play dirty? Fine. I could play dirty too. But first, I had to play it smart. The next morning, just as expected, they came. A group of them, dressed in their weekend casuals, expensive golf shirts and pastel sweaters draped over their shoulders like they were auditioning for a soap opera. Richard Thompson led the pack, his plastic smile stretching so wide I thought his face might crack. "We're so sorry about what happened," he said, placing a dramatic hand over his heart like he actually had one. "If there's anything we can do, please let us know." I wiped the soot from my hands onto my jeans, pretending to consider his words. "Well," I said slowly, "you could tell me who did it." A few of them shifted uncomfortably, but Richard only chuckled, like I had told some great joke. "Oh, come on now," he said, waving dismissively. "Let's not start pointing fingers. Fires happen. It's tragic, but convenient," I interrupted, watching his smile twitch. "For you." The air between us stiffened, tension settling in like storm clouds. One of the HOA board members, a woman with the personality of an expired rice cake, coughed nervously. "You know, if you ever need to relocate, we'd be happy to make you an offer. We know how hard it must be to start over." I grinned, the kind of grin that made people nervous. "Oh, I'm not starting over," I said, stepping closer, lowering my voice just enough to make them lean in. "I'm rebuilding." Richard's smile faltered. And bigger, I continued. Better. You wouldn't believe the ideas I have. A brand new barn. A bigger animal enclosure. Maybe even what do they call it? A community attraction? I let the words hang there, watching the realization dawn in their eyes. You wouldn't, Richard started. I would, I said, still grinning. In fact, I've already called a few contractors. You know, since the HOA is so committed to improving the neighborhood, I'm sure you'll love what I have planned. Their expressions soured, their carefully constructed politeness cracking at the edges. They knew they had made a mistake. They thought burning my farm would break me, force me to take their deal. But all they had done was give me a reason to fight back harder. As they retreated, muttering to each other in hushed voices, I stood there, looking over my ruined land, my smoldering past. They thought they had won. They had no idea what was coming next. The morning after my barn burned down, I stood in the middle of the wreckage, hands on my hips, taking in the smell of charred wood and scorched earth. The HOA thought they had me cornered, that I'd crumble under the weight of my loss and hand over my farm on a silver platter. But they had underestimated just how stubborn I could be. They thought they were dealing with some helpless farmer. They didn't realize they had just declared war on someone who had nothing left to lose and a whole lot of time for revenge. I started small, just enough to rattle their nerves. The first thing I did was install a rooster sanctuary. Not just 1 or 2 roosters, 20. Loud, proud, and filled with the kind of early morning enthusiasm that could wake the dead. The HOA had always complained about my animals making too much noise, so I figured, why not give them something to really complain about? At precisely 4:30 every morning, the chorus began. It was a symphony of chaos, echoing across the pristine lawns of the HOA's picture-perfect neighborhood. The complaints started rolling in immediately. "Your roosters are out of control," one neighbor shrieked over the phone. "Oh, you think so?" I said, feigning surprise. "Must be the new feed. They seem extra happy." Richard Thompson himself came knocking, his face red with frustration. "This is unacceptable," he hissed through gritted teeth. "You're disturbing the entire community." I scratched my chin, pretending to consider his words. "You know," I said thoughtfully, "I seem to recall something about the HOA requiring property owners to maintain a sense of rural charm. Roosters are about as rural as it gets." He looked like he was about to pop a blood vessel. I shut the door in his face before he could come up with a response. Next, I decided to tackle the HOA's obsession with uniformity. Their rules demanded that all properties adhere to a strict aesthetic, neutral tones, manicured lawns, and absolutely no unauthorized structures. So I built a giant pink flamingo statue, 15 feet tall, right in the middle of my front yard. It was hideous. It was magnificent. The HOA threw a fit. They sent me multiple violation notices, claiming it was an eyesore and not in line with community standards. I replied with a letter of my own, citing their vague language against unauthorized structures and arguing that my flamingo was, in fact, a perfectly legal piece of outdoor art. When they tried to hit me with a fine, I paid it in pennies. 50,000 of them, dumped straight onto their pristine HOA office floor. By this point, the war had escalated. The HOA was desperate to regain control, and I was determined to drive them up the wall. That's when I decided it was time for Phase 3, psychological warfare. Every night, strange sounds began echoing through the neighborhood. A low, eerie mooing. The distant clucking of invisible chickens. Occasionally, a burst of maniacal laughter from an unknown source. I had rigged a series of Bluetooth speakers in the trees surrounding the HOA board members' houses, playing randomized farm noises at odd intervals throughout the night. They never knew when the next one would strike. Sleep-deprived and paranoid, they started turning on each other, accusing one another of sabotage. Richard Thompson, normally the picture of arrogance, began looking visibly unhinged. He showed up at my property one afternoon, dark circles under his eyes, his usual smugness replaced with barely concealed desperation. "We know it's you," he muttered, glancing around like someone might be listening. I widened my eyes innocently. Know what's me? The noises. The roosters. The. He gestured wildly at the giant flamingo. All of it. I folded my arms. Richard, are you okay? You look like you haven't been sleeping. He let out a growl of frustration and stormed off. That night, I cranked up the speakers just a little louder. But the real masterpiece of my revenge was yet to come. The HOA had built their power on rules and regulations, so I decided it was time to beat them at their own game. I spent days combing through their bylaws, highlighting every ridiculous, outdated, or poorly worded rule. And then, I followed them to the letter in the most obnoxious way possible. One rule stated that all houses must maintain approved landscaping, but never specified what was approved. So I planted a sprawling vegetable garden right along the HOA's main entrance. Bright, unruly, and absolutely within the rules. Another rule required homeowners to participate in at least one community event per year. So I organized a town-wide barnyard festival, inviting people from all over to come enjoy live music, hayrides, and a petting zoo, right on my farm, directly across from Richard's house. The best part? The HOA was required to sponsor it. By now, the neighborhood was divided. Some people, sick of the HOA's tyranny, began cheering me on. Others, still clinging to their suburban utopia, sent me hate mail. But the real victory came when I discovered the biggest loophole of them all. Buried deep in the HOA's legal documents was a clause about land annexation. Long story short, if a piece of property could prove itself as a vital community resource, it could petition to be recognized as separate from the HOA's jurisdiction. Meaning, if I turned my farm into something the public used and benefited from, I could legally remove myself from their control. And so, with great enthusiasm, I transformed my property into the people's farm. Open to the public. Free to visit. School field trips, local farmers markets, animal therapy sessions. I even hosted a meditation with goats class, which, surprisingly, became a huge hit. The HOA lost their minds. They tried every trick in the book to shut me down, but legally, they couldn't do a thing. I had played by their own rules, twisted their own laws against them, and in the process, made my farm more profitable than ever. Richard Thompson finally broke. One evening, he stood on my porch, defeated, sweat beading on his forehead. He didn't even bother with fake pleasantries this time. Just tell me, he said, voice hoarse, what it's going to take to make you leave. I leaned against the doorframe, taking a long, satisfied breath of fresh farm air. Oh, Richard, I said, shaking my head. I'm not going anywhere. And with that, I shut the door. The war wasn't over yet, but I had already won the battle. The tension in the neighborhood had reached its peak. The HOA was unraveling, their carefully constructed world crumbling under the weight of my relentless counterattacks. Richard Thompson had started looking more like a man on the verge of a nervous breakdown than a community leader. Every attempt to shut me down had backfired spectacularly, and now, with my farm officially recognized as a community resource, they had no legal grounds to force me out. But I wasn't done yet. I wanted the HOA gone for good. Richard wasn't the type to accept defeat easily. He still had one card left to play, and I knew it was only a matter of time before he used it. The HOA had scheduled a special meeting, one that would determine the future of the community and, more importantly, my farm. The official agenda claimed it was about addressing ongoing disruptions, but everyone knew what it really meant. This was their last-ditch effort to take me down. I arrived at the meeting early, making sure to sit front and center, grinning at Richard as he stepped up to the podium. He looked exhausted, his usual arrogance dulled by weeks of frustration. The room was packed, split between die-hard HOA loyalists and the growing faction of residents who had started to enjoy the chaos I had introduced. Richard cleared his throat and launched into a dramatic speech about the importance of community standards and the dangers of uncontrolled rural expansion. He called my farm an unregulated disaster, claiming it was a threat to property values and the well-being of the neighborhood. He talked about noise complaints, traffic issues, and the unbearable stench of manure wafting through the street. I let him talk. I let him build his case, watching as some of the HOA members nodded along while others exchanged skeptical glances. And then, when he was done, I stood up, stretched my arms, and walked slowly to the front of the room. "Richard," I said, smiling, "I have to say, I admire your dedication. Really, I do. But let's talk about threats to the neighborhood, shall we?" I pulled out a stack of papers and began distributing them around the room. Copies of financial reports, emails, legal documents, everything I had spent weeks gathering. Evidence of mismanaged HOA funds, secret backroom deals, and, most damning of all, a paper trail that linked Richard directly to a shady construction company that had been eyeing my land for development long before the fire ever happened. The room went silent. Richard's face drained of color. Now, I'm not saying Richard here had anything to do with my barn mysteriously catching fire, I continued, letting the words hang in the air just long enough to make the accusation clear without actually saying it outright. But it's interesting, isn't it? How a man so concerned about property values had such a strong financial interest in making sure my farm disappeared. Murmurs spread through the crowd. People started flipping through the papers, pointing at numbers, whispering to each other. Richard stammered, trying to refute the evidence, but the damage was done. His supporters were shrinking by the second. And then, because I couldn't resist, I went in for the final blow. "Now, I know the HOA prides itself on being fair and democratic," I said, turning to the board members. "So I'd like to propose a vote. A simple one. Should the HOA continue under its current leadership? Or should we, I don't know, dissolve it entirely?" Gasps echoed through the room. Richard's mouth fell open. He hadn't seen this coming. He had been so focused on getting rid of me that he hadn't realized I was going after the whole system. One by one, hands started going up. First a few hesitant ones, then more. The momentum shifted in real time, and within minutes it was clear. The majority of the neighborhood had turned against the HOA. Richard tried to fight it, tried to rally what little support he had left, but it was too late. The vote was called, and the decision was final. The HOA was officially disbanded. The room erupted into chaos, half the people celebrating, the other half in stunned silence. I turned to Richard, watching as the realization sank in. He had lost everything. I patted him on the shoulder as I walked past. "Tough break, buddy," I said. The fallout was spectacular. Without the HOA, their ridiculous rules vanished overnight. People started painting their houses whatever colors they wanted. Someone put up a massive inflatable dragon in their front yard just because they could. The neighborhood, once sterile and uniform, came alive in ways it never had before. As for me, I turned my farm into something even bigger. The People's Farm wasn't just a fun name anymore, it became a full-fledged attraction. I expanded the petting zoo, started hosting local events, even opened a small farm-to-table restaurant. Tourists started showing up, and soon, my little farm was making more money than I had ever imagined. And Richard? Well, let's just say he didn't handle the loss well. After his little empire collapsed, he tried to sue me, but with his credibility in shambles and his financial records exposed, it went nowhere. Last I heard, he had moved out of the neighborhood entirely, unable to face the people he had spent years controlling. The day he left, I threw a huge farm party, complete with fireworks, live music, and free cider for the whole town. The ex-HOA board members who had turned on Richard showed up too, now desperate to distance themselves from their former leader. And, in the greatest twist of all, some of them even ended up working on my farm as part of a community service agreement after an investigation into their financial mismanagement led to some, let's say, legal consequences. Nothing too serious, just enough to make them shovel pig stalls for a few months. I stood on my porch that night, looking out over my land, feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time. Freedom. They had tried to take everything from me. They had burned down my farm, tried to crush my spirit, used every dirty trick in the book. And now I had everything: the farm, the town's support, and best of all, the knowledge that the people who had tried to destroy me were now knee-deep in pig manure, learning the true meaning of hard work. I took a deep breath, smiling as I listened to the sounds of my farm. The roosters crowing, the cows mooing, the distant laughter of people enjoying their time here. The HOA was gone. My farm was thriving. And in the end, I had won.